Okay, welcome to the Psychology in Schools team introductory programme on childhood neurodiversity. I'm Linda Brindle and I'm with Kelsey Odgers and we're from the Psychology in Schools team. Today we're going to be thinking about what is neurodiversity. We're going to be introducing a whole range of different neurodevelopmental diagnoses in a little while, but the overall aim today is to introduce neurodiversity as a whole and think about what it means for you as families. We're going to discuss the additional challenges you and your families might be facing and also think about how we can talk to our young people and schools about neurodiversity and what resources might be helpful to include when doing this. We'll have time to think about the assessment process so that you understand a little bit more about what you're currently waiting for and how that will go as you're on the NDD, as they call it, pathway. And this is the first in a series of 12 workshops, which hopefully overall will help you as parents to understand about how you can support and champion your children even more with their unique strengths and challenges. Just to remind you that there is a whole series of workshops and others you can book on for this term that are already set up for booking is supporting your child's social relationships, education and anxiety. Those are three of the topics that will be getting covered in the future. So let's just have a little bit of a think about what is neurodiversity. It's a concept that originated in the autistic community and doesn't have a formal agreed definition, but is an umbrella term to describe a range of conditions and differences. Across a population of humans, there will be natural variation in people's brains, how they process the world, their strengths and weaknesses in their skills and behaviour. Neurodiversity is a part of normal human evolution, and having people in society who see the world differently and have unique skills is a really important part of human life to be celebrated. The term neurotypical refers to those people whose brain processes, skills and behaviours are considered to be standard or typical in society. And the term neurodivergent was created as the opposite to neurotypical, to refer to people whose brains work differently to the typical cultural standards. So neurodivergence includes a number of things. It includes conditions that people were born with, including autism, ADHD, Tourette's, learning disability, and a range of learning disorders that Kelsey's going to talk about later when we think about the diagnostic criteria for some of these. But neurodivergence also refers to people whose brain works differently due to illness or injury. So illnesses of the brain might include things like epilepsy or brain injury. So we thought it was important just to explain the breadth of what neurodiversity covers before we move on to other things. So I wonder what percentage of people you think are neurodivergent. Those of you who haven't already joined, do please join slido.com. You can use a QR code on the screen or search on your browser for slido.com. And once you've found the link that says join at, input the code on the screen. Thanks very much, everyone that's joined in for this. Across studies estimate that around 15 to 20% of the population are neurodivergent. So whilst a bit less than what some of you think, I think we understand that there's a recognising acknowledgement of the increased number of neurodivergent people around. And of course, this is a study, so things are always changing. Thanks very much for joining in that first quiz question. Now, just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about language. Language is a really personal choice. Some people prefer to refer to themselves as neurodiverse rather than neurodivergent. Some people like to think of their neurodivergence as having a superpower, but others don't. Some people identify as having a disability, whereas others with the same diagnosed condition might not consider themselves disabled. So I guess what we're recognising is that actually what's most important is that you as families and your children find words and explanations that work best for you. So we appreciate that our choice of language might also not suit everyone here. So for example, we're going to use the phrase autistic people rather than person with autism. And we're going to do that because generally that's the language that we've found is a preference for autistic people that we've worked with. But that language we know still might not be everyone's preference. So we're just going to make it really clear at the beginning of the workshop. In our experience, neurodivergent young people really find value in being part of a community, whether it's through peer groups at local schools, if they're children that are attending school, or actually also in our rural communities, as well as for those not attending school. This might be through social media or websites. I guess however it's done, we know the importance of people feeling supported who, as an identity, have neurodivergence, that they will really benefit from linking up and forming a sense of community and connection with others. We know that sense of belonging and understanding can be really key when you connect to others. And I guess that's highlighting this culture of neurodivergent community that's out there that should be encouraged. When we're thinking about language, we're also wanting to recognise a use of a term which also often comes up in this area. And that's something that parents may and other people may talk about as having challenging behaviours when they're thinking about this child. And this is a term that many people use to describe their experience of behaviours that others around the child might find difficult or challenging. While some people prefer the term behaviours that challenge or behaviours of distress, we also know that that's a personal choice. What I guess we're wanting to mention is that there is a shift away from the use of challenging behaviours for a particular reason, because of concern around behaviours not actually being challenging to the individual who is acting in a particular way, but those behaviours may cause challenges for the people around them. And the term challenging behaviours, that term might put the problem and difficulty unfairly on the child. But we also know that behaviours of distress is a term that doesn't capture all behaviours. And we know that some behaviours that may be related to excitement could equally be challenging to a carer or difficult to manage, even if for the child, actually, they're just very excited about something. So again, we're just highlighting that language is a personal choice, so that when asking questions on the Slido questions, please use any terms that fit for your family and for your experience. So another Slido question: what does neurodiversity mean to you? What does it mean to you and to your family, or what does it mean for your young person? A different way of thinking, not seen as the norm. A child who is struggle with things that others manage well. Thinking and processing differently. Unique approach to situations, some of which may not always be the same as others expect. Not seen as normal, but society has changed. Thank you for your different comments. I guess we know that difference is so important for the human experience of growth and diversity and learning. And a lot of you have put a theme around difference. Who we are, knowing our brains may work differently to a neurotypical person, but it's not always a bad thing. A child that struggles with emotions means our brains are amazingly different and creative, that everything in normal life can challenge us. Yeah, it can be challenging for us. past way of thinking, it would be seen as bringing the problem child, but we now know more, absolutely. Understanding my child needs things adapted to suit their needs. Thanks very much for sharing a whole range of views about, your different experiences around neurodiversity and what it means to you. It's so helpful for us to hear that, and I know from what other audiences have said, for different audiences, everyone in this room now, to hear those different experiences that you will have. Thank you. Although neurodiversity is a normal part of human evolution, unfortunately, as we've talked about, the world is typically designed for and by neurotypical people, which can make life for neurodivergent people feel really difficult, especially when accessing things like healthcare or being included socially, engaging in education at school and in the workplace. So historically, healthcare systems tried to cure neurodivergent people and trying to enforce neurotypical standards of behaviour and to exclude people who didn't fit into that typical neurotypical box, so to speak. More recently, the neurodiversity movement has advocated for moving away from seeing neurodivergence as a disorder or a deficit, and instead towards understanding the challenges faced by neurodivergent people and celebrating the unique strengths and characteristics that neurodivergent people bring to society. And I think, what we're talking about here, you've really reflected in some of the comments that you've already made in the Slido comments today. There's so much more of this to hear about on social media, with different influences speaking openly about their experiences, which I'm sure a lot of you and your young people are aware of. So we all need to move towards understanding and embracing neurodiversity. As somebody said, it's a different world now. And as we are recognizing where neurotypical standards create barriers for neurodivergent people and making appropriate adaptations to remove these barriers to improve the lives of neurodivergent people. And this is everyone's business, isn't it? And this can be a particular challenge we appreciate in education settings for young people and their families. And it's often where we see families of neurodivergent children struggling. So we're going to think about that a little bit more later on today. And we will have a workshop later this term that specifically focuses on supporting your child in education. So holding that in mind, I wonder, what are your fears for your child? Another Slido question. What worries you about the future? Acceptance of how he is, being misunderstood, lonely, acceptance by peers. They won't fit into society. We want them to live a normal life. Feeling too different, or life, they're failing at life because of their struggles with impulses and emotions. Concern around, if they are not at school, the impact on the career. More about social groups accepting, and concern about not being able to work, masking, mental health issues, not mixing. Less and less able to mask as they get older, so that can lead to exhaustion and overwhelm. Being vulnerable, support for learning, pressure in high school. Growing up lonely and not knowing how to function in a neurotypical world. It sounds like managing exams or workplaces which aren't at making adjustments for people whose brain works differently. Being easily led. Thank you. So you're really highlighting some themes about both the vulnerability of some that you feel for, or worry about for some of your young people. Not being understood, behaviours being misunderstood, and the unhelpfulness about that. unreasonable pressures being put on, a whole range of things. Thank you for sharing those deeply felt fears and concerns that you have for your child. They're they're really powerful and really tough, aren't they, to sort of be holding and walking through, holding on to those things as you sort of try to support your child as best you can on their journey. We really hope that we can help with some things throughout this workshop series to help guide or give some pointers in a way that might help support you to support your child as best you can with their particular needs of being in a neurotypical world. Let's just have a little think about some of the developmental diagnoses. We're going to think in detail in a little bit of time, but we thought it was important to cover this. So just want to highlight that we know some of you might know a lot in some of these areas, but we do see that this is our foundation workshop. So this lays the groundwork to everything else we'll cover in the series. So in that series, we'll then be thinking about what it is like to for your child to manage some challenges, what are behind these labels and what can be helpful. That's what we'll be thinking about as we go through this workshop series. So just for now, I wonder if you can share with us on Slido, what are some of the biggest challenges that your child's neurodivergence brings to them or to your family? How does it impact on their abilities or their life? Yes, and some of you have already mentioned and again put here that some of the challenges can come from the systems around them where they're maybe not designed to meet their needs or there's not understanding around neurodiversity. So that's really a theme within school, and also challenges of settling in and keeping in school. Other challenges are focus on simple tasks, social interaction, challenges in keeping your child safe. Treading on eggshells. So how do you support a child when they're really struggling with their emotions? Challenges going places, keeping others safe, thinking about family relationships. Trying to manage, I think somebody's talking about a sort of challenge of not feeling like the child. Sorry, it's gone off the screen, but something around not feeling like your child. You can sort of trying to manage, thank you, Kelsey. Frustration from him, not feeling like we understand what he's saying, but also as a family, as I'm also being assessed. Yeah, people trying to convey emotions or conversations can be really tricky. Thanks for sharing that. Thank you. We can move back along. Stresses with school then can lead to stresses at home, trying to get to outside school activities, meltdowns, protecting siblings, understanding from others, not feeling understood. Isn't that such a big one? And again, school, not everyone is a learner in that environment. We need active hands-on, change the system. That sounds like somebody that's really, really had a lot of challenges with supporting their child in that area. Thanks so much for sharing those things just now. Got another Slido for you. So we're moving from having thought about some of the biggest challenges to really thinking about some of your child's strengths. Out of the box thinking. Actually, somebody mentioned something already earlier about how their child's just can be amazing in some of the way that they think about things. So thank you. Out of the box thinking from a different position, having different ideas. Somebody talked to us about how their child just came up with a totally novel way to do something that was just so helpful in problem solving in the situation. It's really exciting. And here you are, somebody's put problem solving too. Greater art and building things, anything physical and creative, loving. His knowledge of the subject he loves is incredible. Thinks with great detail on subjects, talented, creative, artistic, amazing memory, brings fun to our family. That's quite a theme that we found as well, having how loving they can be, even when people can be so mean. Yes, wow, that's powerful, isn't it? strict sense of fairness and justice. Yeah, yeah. Loves building things. So empathetic and loving to family, someone you can trust, needing to understand the full answer to everything. Yeah, really trying to make everything make sense. Absolutely. And intelligent. Thank you. Those are some amazing strengths that you shared. And we'll be holding on to some of those things, and we'll be bringing those out, I think, during the workshop today, and the different things that we're talking about. And knowledge of Star Wars. Wow. Wow. Yes. That special knowledge that some some young people who are neurodivergent have can be an amazing thing to hear and experience. Now we're going to pass over to Kelsey to think a little bit more about some specific diagnosis in more detail.
Thanks, Linda. Yes, and thank you to everyone for sharing the things you have on the Slido. It's really useful, as Linda said, I think both for us as presenters, because we can kind of talk to some of that as we present some information, but also I think for that shared experience and hearing from other families is really useful. So as Linda said, we're going to be talking you through some specific diagnoses now in a lot more detail. And what I would say here is just please bear with us because it's an awful lot of information and some of which you will already know because again, we know that there's a broad range of experience and knowledge in this room right now. So yes, as I said, please just bear with us as we go through. So we're going to firstly start with autism. So other terms we might hear here might be autism spectrum disorder or autism spectrum condition. And as we kind of named when we thought about language, often people prefer to be called autistic as an identity rather than person with autism or a child with autism. And I often think here about a young person who once told me they don't carry their autism around with them in a bag. And actually, it's totally part of who they are. So that's the language that I'll be using. So, when we think about the diagnostic criteria for autism, we focus on these four areas we see here on the slide. But it's really important to remember, of course, that each individual autistic child is unique and they'll really vary in aspects of these four areas and kind of which areas might be strengths of theirs and which areas might be more difficult for them. So the first area is language and communication. So this may include a delay in developing language for a child. It might be them speaking in a formal or an unusual way. So they might perhaps repeat phrases they've heard on TV, which we call echolalia, or they might have difficulty understanding jokes and sarcasm, also in initiating and sustaining conversation, as well as picking up on verbal and non-verbal communication or cues. So they might find it difficult to pick up when another person they're speaking to maybe isn't interested in that topic anymore, or when it's time to let another person speak. So moving on to social and emotional understanding. So this could include difficulties making and keeping friendships, difficulty understanding their own and other people's emotions, and also understanding other subtle intentions might be really difficult, which can cause, difficulties in those social communication areas. And also thinking about eye contact. So, for some young people with this diagnosis, that's unusual. So it could be no eye contact at all, or it could be prolonged. Another area is flexibility of thought and behavior. And this is a tendency for rigidly held beliefs, often called black and white thinking. It's around disliking change, so needing a sense of kind of a strong routine, which means that changes or unexpected things can be really difficult for some young people. Also, obsessions with objects or topics. So we saw some of that in the Slido, didn't we? I think one of them was Star Wars potentially. So maybe being quite focused on a particular area and talking a lot about that, learning a lot about that, kind of incredible amount. Um, Repetitive gestures called stimming or stimulating behaviors, and that could be different things such as jumping up and down or rocking backwards and forwards if distressed or quite excited, as well as kind of restricted interests would fall under that character, that category. So we know that many autistic people have differences also in sensory processing. So that's the kind of fourth area. And that's both in being over and under sensitive to sensory input. So for example, it could be disliking loud noises, or the opposite, disliking silence, not liking the texture of certain clothing or certain food, which can lead to other difficulties, and also noticing smells that other people don't notice. So kind of those broad range of sensory information. So when we consider whether or not a young person meets the criteria for autism, actually we think about whether they've been there since early childhood, and also whether there's an impact on that young person's everyday functioning. So it's really important that they would have been there since early childhood and also have an impact. And it's also important to share that whilst these differences can be part of an autistic presentation, they also may be better accounted for by something else or as just a standalone difficulty. So, for example, many people have sensory sensitivities but are not autistic. And also people who are anxious or who may have had difficult life experiences could become quite inflexible in their thoughts and behavior as a way of really coping with what they've experienced. So that's why kind of exploring these different areas within different contexts is important as part of that assessment process. So with all that said, we've got some true or false Slido questions for you now around autism. So true or false, autistic people don't like socializing. Okay. So majority there saying false. So absolutely, autistic people might socialize differently to neurotypical people. And also, many autistic people might find social situations anxiety provoking, but that doesn't mean that all autistic people don't like socializing. And actually, in fact, what we know is that lots of autistic people actually really want friendships and to be involved in social situations and are actually very loyal and caring friends to other people. So, another one now, all autistic people have genius abilities. So, true or false? I'll give you a bit of time. People to respond to. Okay, so 100% so far are saying false. So yes. So if you've seen films like Rain Man, and other programs and films on the telly, we know that actually these are great because whilst they raise kind of awareness of autism, which is really important, they may have also kind of perpetuated a bit of a myth that all autistic people have kind of these genius abilities or superpower-like qualities. And as we've said, every autistic person is different and they have different abilities and interests, just like neurotypical people. But some autistic people really truly have exceptional, intense special interests and abilities. But because of that, some people then wrongly assume that all autistic people must have them too. You know, they must all be great at maths and science, but that's not necessarily the case. And actually, some autistic people find those things really, really difficult and actually may have strengths in more creative areas such as art and drama, which I think is what a lot of you actually were saying on the Slido there too. Okay, so true or false, autistic people have empathy. Yeah, so majority, I think all at the moment are saying true. So yes, another misconception here is that autistic people don't have empathy. And when we think about empathy, that's really the ability to understand and share experiences of another person. And this myth is likely to be related to research, which shows that a common cognitive difficulty for autistic people is something called theory of mind. Now, theory of mind is the ability to imagine a situation from another person, from someone else's perspective. However, it's not the case then that all autistic people have difficulties in that area. And actually, we know that autistic people are often working extremely hard to try and work out what someone else is thinking and feeling, even if that's difficult for them. And often they feel really upset when perhaps they've missed a cue, and find out that someone else is upset. Absolutely. Okay, so well, because we're talking about autism, we wanted to kind of recognize and say a little bit more about autism in girls. So we know that currently around 4 times as many boys than girls have an autism diagnosis, which is significant. But there is evidence that autism is underdiagnosed in girls. So basically, what that means is it's actually harder for girls to get a diagnosis of autism compared to boys. And we think this is for a number of reasons. So, firstly, generally speaking, again, this doesn't apply to all, autistic girls are more socially motivated than autistic boys. So they generally really want to make friends, they want to socialize, which may mean that adults around them may not notice more subtle kind of social difficulties that they might have, such as conflict in their friendships. Whereas the social communication difficulties in autistic boys may be more obvious because they may be more isolated or maybe less interested in socializing. Another term to think about here is masking. And I know this is something that came up a couple of times actually in the Slidos. So it's a term that some of you have heard of. But essentially, masking is kind of referring to when neurodivergent people try and hide or cover up their difficulties. So, for example, trying really hard to learn social norms to try and fit in or not show their distress. And masking, we think, is more common in autistic girls than autistic boys, which can cause a significant amount of stress and anxiety for girls trying to cover up the fact that they're struggling. And again, lots of you alluded to that it's really exhausting when young people are masking. So that's something else that we kind of wonder might lead to this kind of the undiagnosed autism in girls. But it's important to mention that whilst autistic people can mask, it's actually a really kind of a part of typical human behavior, and that people can mask, all of us can mask for different reasons, such as when we feel anxious or uncomfortable in a situation, or if we have different views to another person and don't feel able to express that in the moment. So masking isn't exclusively something that autistic people do. Um, and finally, there's also evidence that autistic girls are more likely to struggle with emotional difficulties, so things like low mood and anxiety, compared to autistic boys. And again, perhaps this means that adults around them supporting them, such as in school or other professionals and adults they have contact with, might be focusing more on those emotional difficulties and getting those needs met, whilst missing some of the other difficulties or missing what's underlying some of those things. So obviously that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and we could say more about this. Unfortunately, we don't have time. But just to kind of highlight there, when you get the slides, there'll be a link to the ACAM podcast, which is a great podcast around autism in girls. And this is actually part of a broader podcast series for parents of autistic children that you'll get in the resource pack, which might be of interest to you. Great. So thinking now, we're coming to the end of kind of thinking about autism, but it's of course important to highlight that there are so many strengths too. I think loads of which were kind of highlighted in that slider around your young people's strengths. So autistic people being less flexible in thought and behavior actually means they have a strong sense of right and wrong, which again is something I remember someone putting. So there's a kind of strong sense about the right morals, following rules, and then being extremely loyal to the people they're close to. And we absolutely need people like that, don't we? Autistic people often have fantastic attention to detail, perhaps noticing those small details in the environment that other people wouldn't notice because they're perhaps really paying attention to that sensory information as well as other things. And they're also able to kind of deeply focus on tasks and topics, which is why, when they have those special interests, they're able to learn things in such great detail, have such great, fantastic memory for those things and for certain facts, which is a real strength of theirs. Okay. So we'll move on now to think about ADHD. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is another neurodevelopmental condition which is characterized by persistent inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity, which is more excessive than would be expected for the child's developmental stage. So that's really important to kind of compare that child to kind of similar age peers. So, in terms of an assessment, they'd be looking to see if these difficulties were firstly impacting on functioning and development for that young person, but also if they'd been present early in childhood, so before the age of 12, essentially. And the other important thing is that ADHD can only be diagnosed when these symptoms are present across a kind of different settings, such as home, school, or other settings that that young person is in. So ADHD is characterized into three presentations in the DSM-5, which is the kind of current diagnostic manual that is used. So the three kind of presentations are predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and combined ADHD. So that's all three of the pie chart sections together, the pie chart you see there on the slide. So if we come to each of those difficulties in turn, so attention difficulties might look like difficulty concentrating, seemingly quite forgetful, unable to kind of remain on a task, struggling to follow instructions, and because of that inattention, making careless mistakes. Hyperactivity is kind of the being unable to sit still, constantly fidgeting, always being on the go, talking excessively, I guess seeming to have an endless amount of energy. And then finally, impulsivity, that can look like different things as well. So it could be speaking before thinking, so interrupting conversations, difficulty waiting turn, or risky behavior, which kind of shows a lack of sense of danger. So it might be running across the road or climbing things that are too high. And we know that about 5% of all children and young people would meet the criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD. But what's important here is that some studies show that up to 20% of children actually struggle with traits of ADHD. So they have difficulties with these three areas of, attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity without meeting the criteria for a formal diagnosis. And that's around 1 in 5 children, which is significant and useful to kind of hold on to. And just to say, we've got a video here, and there was also a video in the previous slide around autism as well, talking about kind of people's lived experiences. So the one on autism was a young girl called Rosie King talking about their experience of having autism and some common misconceptions. So please go back to that slide when you get sent them and follow that link. And the link here about ADHD includes an interview with the Mercury Music Prize and Brit Award nominee, Loyal Kana, about his experience of ADHD, some of the difficulties he faced as a child, but also reflecting on some of the positive things that ADHD brings to his life. And just to say, he also runs a cooking school in London for children with ADHD called Chili con Carne, which I thought was a lovely thing to share. So do look into him a bit more if you're interested. So we've got some true or false now on ADHD. So true or false, ADHD doesn't exist. Some children are just naughty. Give a second for people to kind of answer. Yep, so 100% so far saying false. Yes. And I could see from the Slidos that sadly this is a narrative that some of you have heard before. So some people have wrongly said that ADHD is just a label as an excuse for naughty. But what we know is, and what we wanted to share with you, is that scientific evidence shows that people with ADHD genuinely have differences in their brain structure, which affects their attention system and also their reward system in their brain, which impacts on hyperactivity and impulsivity. So for children with ADHD, with these structural differences in their brain, actually it makes things like keeping still, waiting for things, not acting on impulse, actually extremely difficult. And they may then wrongly be perceived by other people as naughty, but this is not a conscious choice, and actually it's incredibly difficult for them. And the other thing to say here is that it's important to recognize that our culture really sets expectations of what's considered naughty or kind of okay behavior. So, for example, in schools, there's kind of an expectation for children to sit still, to concentrate for long periods of time, to be really organized. So, remember things like PE kits and homework, and to not kind of interrupt the teacher or to shout out. And we know that for most children, these things are really, really difficult. These expectations are too tough for them. But for children with ADHD or ADHD traits, those expectations can make school actually an incredibly difficult environment, and often lead those children to be either kind of told off a lot or criticized as well. This can make things really difficult. So true or false, children with ADHD can concentrate on some things. So, yeah, people are currently saying 100% true. Yes. So, people often think about ADHD as means you can't pay attention at all, which absolutely isn't true. So, as I mentioned on that first slide about ADHD, not all children with a diagnosis have attention problems because you can meet diagnostic criteria with just the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. And actually, even those children with ADHD who do struggle with attention, they may actually be fantastic at concentrating and paying attention to things, specific things that they're interested in, like a hobby or a project they're doing. And actually, we know that for some children with ADHD, they may actually concentrate too much on one specific thing, kind of forgetting about all the other important things that they needed to do. So an example of this might be a young person with ADHD, saying, I'm going to go to my room, I'm going to go and get changed. And actually, when they go to their room, they find a book or maybe something else been interested in, and they get totally engrossed in that story, completely forgetting that they need to get changed and ultimately making themselves late for school. So we can see how that can kind of cause difficulties as well. So finally, true or false, ADHD only affects boys. Yeah, so 100 people, 100% saying false, yes. So while evidence shows that boys are actually 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, girls can definitely be diagnosed with it. And again, similarly to autism, it's likely undiagnosed in girls. And actually, interestingly, girls are more likely to be diagnosed with the inattentive type of ADHD. Okay, so finally, before we move on, um, we know that there are loads of ADHD strengths. So living with ADHD can give children and young people a unique view on life. So being able to come up with creative and inventive ideas or problem solving. And actually, that can have a range of positive impacts, with friends and with family. It can also make young people much more courageous in taking kind of positive risks or trying new things and making brave chances for themselves, which makes life feel more fun for them and for everyone around them. People with ADHD are often much more spontaneous, which can be really fun for others to be around. So they might be really great, for example, of coming up with a game on the spot for them or their friends or their family to play. So again, really nice to be around that. Also, they can become super focused on things they're interested in, often called hyper focus. So, again, having kind of knowledge and skills in a particular area. And of course, when we think about that energetic side that some children with ADHD have, they're often kind of full of that energy, full of that passion for life and for specific things in life, which again is a really nice thing to be around. Perfect. So hopefully you're able to kind of stick with us. I appreciate we've already given a lot of information and there's a bit more still to come. So we're going to be now talking about a diagnosis of learning disability, sometimes called intellectual disability. And learning disability is different from a specific learning disorder, such as dyslexia, which I'm going to come to a little bit later on. But in a nutshell, a child with a learning disability finds it more difficult to learn, understand, and do things compared to other children of the same age. So, when a child is younger than school age, these difficulties are likely to be called global development delay, which might be something you've heard also. But there are really two key aspects to a diagnosis of a learning disability, which are important to hold in mind, and you can see there on the screen. So the first is significant impairment in intellectual functioning. And this really refers to general intelligence and skills, and importantly means that very low functioning across a wide range of cognitive areas need to be present for this to be made. So it could be areas such as memory, problem solving, learning, and language. So it's about that general kind of low functioning in these areas and not just deficits in specific skills. And diagnosis of this usually comes from formal cognitive tests to explore these different areas, usually completed by a psychologist. The second criteria for diagnosis of learning disability is significant difficulties with daily life skills, known as adaptive functioning, again, compared to what you would expect for the child's age. So this would be across a range of different areas, such as difficulty with independence, with friendships, with activities of daily living, such as eating and drinking, getting dressed, hygiene, as well as safety in the community. So when assessing for a learning disability, we're looking to see that the low intellectual functioning and significant problems of daily life skills are long-standing in childhood. So that actually what we need to see is that there was significant development delay or problems in early childhood, and these aren't new difficulties that have emerged. And a learning disability diagnosis is currently split further into kind of broad areas of mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And just to say, there's a useful link there to the MenCap Mythbusters video, which challenges some of the myths and explains more about the lived experience of learning disability. Which again you'll get with the slides. So a few true and false now. True or false? Autism is a learning disability. Okay, so currently 100% saying false, so yes. So the term learning disability we know can be confusing, and the word of the label has actually changed over the years. But a learning disability, as we said, is that specific diagnosis for low intellectual functioning and significant difficulties with adaptive or daily life skills. And we know that some people with a learning disability may be autistic, but certainly not everybody. So another one here, true or false, people with a learning disability can be independent. So 100% so far saying true. So yes, absolutely. So although people with a learning disability might need extra support, they can absolutely be independent and live a happy and fulfilling life. And that we know many adults with a learning disability have a job, they have other hobbies that they're involved with, they have great friends and can live in their own home independently. So along those same lines, thinking about learning disability strengths now, people with a learning disability are often friendly, loving, honest, and kind. They have some interesting hobbies and other interests that they usually like to share with other people. And people with a learning disability often face many challenges, but can be really resilient to the challenges that they're faced with. And we wanted to share with you a really lovely study done in 2022, which looked at the personal character strengths of over 11,000 people with disabilities. And among the people with a learning disability, the top five character strengths were love of learning, were honesty, fairness, judgment, and appreciation of beauty and excellence, which we thought was a lovely thing to share with you as we kind of come to the end of presenting what a learning disability is and what that can look like. So we're going to think now about specific learning disorders, and these are different to a learning disorder, as I said just now. And these refer to a range of specific significant difficulties with learning and processing different types of information compared to what we would expect of a child of the same age. So you can see that's been a theme as I've been talking, that it's always kind of comparing that young person and their difficulties to where their kind of same age peers are at, because that is really important. So firstly, dyslexia, and this refers to a difficulty with acquiring and processing language, which you may have heard. And this usually displays in children as a difficulty with reading, spelling, and writing. Often we know that people with dyslexia have difficulty linking letters they see on a page with the sounds that those letters should make, which then, of course, makes reading slow and difficult. Children might describe the words on a page as looking jumbled or blurred when they have dyslexia. And of course, then they may avoid reading whenever they can, preferring to kind of use pictures, video, or audio instead, because it's a lot easier for them. And children with dyslexia also might find it difficult to tell left from right. So that's another useful thing to be aware of. Dyscalculia is another specific learning disorder, and that refers to difficulty learning and understanding number concepts and maths calculations, which of course then makes it difficult for children to do maths, but also to do other things that involve numbers, such as telling the time. Dysgraphia, again, another disorder which refers to a difficulty with putting thoughts onto paper. So children with this can show difficulties with spelling, with grammar, with punctuation, and also handwriting. And then finally, we've got developmental coordination disorder, otherwise known as dyspraxia, which you may have heard of. And this refers to a difficulty with planning and executing physical actions with your body, again related to spatial and perceptual problems. And in children with this, we might see difficulties again with writing, but also in other areas such as putting on clothes, riding a bike, playing kind of physical games and sports, so kind of throwing and catching a ball, as well as using cutlery as well. And just to say, I know we haven't given loads and loads of detail on these specific areas, but when you get the slides, you'll see that these different kind of words on the screen are actually links that will take you to further information about those different areas. So please do that if you want to find out more. So we wanted to highlight another specific learning disorder called developmental language disorder. And the reason we wanted to highlight this is due to its high prevalence and also the impact it has on young people. So developmental language disorder is a problem learning or using language that doesn't go away. So there's kind of two specific parts to it. As I said, persistent difficulties in the acquisition, understanding, production, or the use of language, and also significant limitations in communication with functional impact on daily life at home or at school or other places. Now, DLD affects approximately 1 in 14 children in primary schools, so that's around 2 in every class, which is really significant. And actually, what that means is the prevalence of this is actually greater than autism, ADHD, and learning disability. But actually, very, very much less is known about it, which again can make this really tricky for young people and their families who receive this diagnosis. Um, Similarly to all the things I talked about, this emerges in early childhood and persists into adulthood. And it's often described as an invisible disability because it's not always obvious. So some of the most obvious difficulties might be with attention and listening, with processing, behavior, learning, friendships, and emotional well-being due to the impact it has. And characteristics include challenges with social communication, difficulties expressing thoughts, and understanding others' speech as well. And because of that, DLD can often be mistaken for other things and isn't always recognized as a language problem. So it's a really useful thing to kind of be aware of and kind of think about if your young person kind of has challenges in any of those areas. So thank you so much for bearing with me for that section. I realise it was an awful lot of information, but hopefully some bits and some new information that you found useful. And if there are any bits you want to kind of follow up on, hopefully those resources and slide links will be useful for you. So I'm going to hand back over to Linda now, who's going to think more about the co-occurring challenges. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Kelsey. So Kelsey's just been focusing, so we've really narrowed in on specific diagnostic criteria. So now we're going to zoom back out again and think a bit more about the bigger picture. Hopefully we've given you some useful information you weren't aware of before, but let's now just think about some sort of co-occurring challenges that can happen. So co-occurrence is when two or more things are presenting at the same time. And this is really high in neurodivergent conditions. So for example, about half of children with ADHD also have a specific learning disorder. And some studies show that up to 70% of children with ADHD also have autism traits. It might not be that they have enough traits to make a full diagnosis or reach the full diagnosis, but they do have traits which may be causing them some difficulties. It's also important to consider that having a neurodivergent brain might not be the only factor affecting a child's health, emotions, learning behaviour and friendships. So you can see how we've got a whole host of different things on the slide, on the screen in front of you. A child and their family may be affected by a cost of living crisis, as many people are, by family separation, or perhaps stressful life events like there being domestic violence experienced in the home. Or it could be that at school a young person might be experiencing bullying or the stress that can come and pressure around exams. We also know how much children can get affected when their bodies are changing, when they're going through puberty and adolescence. And of course, by suffering other things like for having an illness or an accidental injury. I guess what we're wanting to do by raising these co-occurring challenges is that recognise that it's important to consider the whole host of factors that may be going on when you see a child or your child struggling, and not just automatically jumping to the conclusion that it must be part of this neurodevelopmental disorder that you're waiting to hear about. But instead, it might be that, for example, if a child's experiencing anxiety and struggling to make friends, that might not mean they're neurodivergent, or even if they have a diagnosis, having that condition may not be really the basis for which they're having those struggles. It might be because of something upsetting that's happened in their life, or they're struggling with a difficult transition. So I guess this slide is about helping us to sort of remember and hold in mind the overlap between some of these factors. And we'll be thinking about how some of these factors alongside neurodiversity a little bit more in the workshops that we cover in subsequent months. And we'll be going into a lot more depth there. But this is just to hold it on your radar for now. So I've got another question. I wonder, what do you think is valuable about having a diagnosis for your child? To get the support we require, getting and help and support they deserve, accessing the right support. So a lot of similar themes there. Affirmation, yeah, sort of confirming what maybe was suspected, feeling more able to ask for support, feeling a sense of normality, not being kicked out of school, I think that said, recognizing and validating struggles. Yeah, that importance of feeling that people understand and can acknowledge that there are reasons why they're having difficulties, that there are some differences there. Getting more help and any help. I can really hear that plea of really having struggled to get that help. Them receiving the support or accommodations they need. Yes, exactly. So talk about reasonable adjustments that should be made to support people with differences, whatever they may be, for both at school, but also in the future, and helping them to understand themselves. There's something that can be really important when somebody makes sense of what's going on for them, and it all sort of makes a lot of things click. So we understand why sort of having that sense can really make a difference for people, understanding how to manage and support in school. Thank you. Thank you. So when we think and talk about neurodiversity in childhood, we are not here just talking about young people who fit into the diagnostic criteria, because we know that that criteria sort of fits for a limited number of people. But actually, we know that there's a broader range of neurodivergent young people whose brains are working differently, who will have unique strengths, but may find some aspects of life really challenging for them. And so whilst only a small minority of people with such difficulties and traits will fit the diagnostic criteria for a certain diagnosis, such as ADHD or ASD or others, we do know that many other people actually have the traits, They may not meet the diagnostic criteria, but they will still significantly struggle with aspects of life and could really benefit from support. Now, this slide, it talks about something called, or showing an example of something called the spiky profile. And autistic people are sometimes described as having this spiky profile of skills, which means they might be very skilled in one area, but need a lot of support in another. And so each day can be different for them, and the levels of support someone needs might change as a result of this. So because of the spiky profile, I guess we're wanting to just highlight that it's really important not to underestimate a young person's skills and abilities, or conversely, expect them to perform well in all areas. So it's helpful to always ask the person how they want to be supported each time. And I think this slide is a helpful thing for parents and carers, but it can also be really helpful to share with other people who are supporting your child. So if you look on the image on the right-hand side of that colourful circle, there's some black dots on that circle, if you can see. And this is sort of representing this spiky profile. So you might have a young person who's really strong, got really strong language skills and actually also very good perception, but they might have more struggles and have some limitations when it comes to their motor skills. You can see that dot closer into the middle of the circle for motor skills, and even more so, their sensory filter may mean that they really struggle around sensory sensitivities, and they're really impacted with it, noise, light, smells, all sorts of other ways in which their senses mean that they are impacted around things around them. And so in this spiky profile, I guess this is just a real good example of highlighting how it's important to share with people the different way in which neurodivergent young people might present at different times. So accessing support for your child for their education, healthcare, or needs in the home is not actually reliant on developmental diagnosis. Support should be available from various sources. So it might interest you to know, if you're not aware already, that schools can access consultation with specialist teachers and mental health professionals for advice on supporting children, regardless of whether or not they have a diagnosis. We know that it can be a challenge sometimes for families, and you've indicated it in the Slido question today that it seems like some schools do not work on a needs basis, but actually adaptations in the classroom can be made regardless of a diagnosis. So instead, supporting the child by focusing on their needs, what is impacting them, is possible. So adjustments can be made so that your child can thrive regardless of a diagnosis. So we wanted to really highlight that here. So if you're feeling your hands are tied while you're on this waiting journey, waiting to have contact with teams, then actually know that you can go ahead and advocate for your child and highlight the needs that are present regardless of a diagnosis. So in doing that advocating or speaking to your children yourself or their siblings about neurodiversity, we've got a range of different resources. You might find one of these helpful when you do share information with others. The Umbrella Gang is a comic created by the ADHD Foundation about a fantastic group of neurodivergent children, helping other children understand neurodiversity and supporting neurodivergent friends with the challenges they face. So that you can access free online at the link, which you'll be able to access when you get the email with all these resources within the next couple of weeks. There's a news round video up there, and there's a really lovely animated video on what autism is as well here. So for sharing with children and siblings to help explain what a diagnosis means and what life might be like for an autistic child. So again, a whole host of lovely resources. In terms of speaking to school, here's another great resource that's a free curriculum for mainstream primary schools. So it's specifically focused on children aged 8 to 11-year-olds to introduce the concept of neurodiversity family. So that's another brilliant resource. So we know that attending school can be difficult for some children with neurodiversity. So for those of you who have children who are in school, which we recognise isn't all of you, we'd encourage you to be your child's champion when speaking with school staff, whether they're the teacher, head of year, TA, pastoral team, or Senko. And sometimes if one person doesn't seem so ready to listen, try and speak to a different person in the school, because sometimes it's just about finding that right person who can really hold your child in mind and think about their needs a little bit more creatively. And I guess when you contact school, we'd really encourage you to remember to share your child's positives and unique strengths, just as you have with us today. This will really help the school staff to get a more rounded view of your child and understand them better. So I guess it's just to remind you again, remember that schools can access consultation and support from other services, such as special education services and mental health services for their children, for your children in school, regardless of the diagnosis. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Kelsey to think about what neurodevelopmental assessments will look like.
Thank you, Linda. Yep, so we are coming to the end. This is the kind of final section where I'm going to run through neurodevelopmental assessments in Suffolk to give you a bit more information about what that looks like. And then we'll come to the end where we share some resources and we have some final Slidos as well. So as I said, we'll be talking through the autism and ADHD assessment process in Suffolk on the next few slides, because we know all of you here are kind of have a child waiting on at least one of these pathways. But because we've talked about some other diagnoses today, we wanted to share some key information about pursuing additional assessments for your child if you feel that would be useful. So thinking about learning disability firstly, so if you're concerned that your child has a learning disability, then please speak to their nursery or their school or education provider for their opinion. And then we'd recommend you speak to your GP, and if appropriate, they then may make a referral onto paediatrics. And then for specific learning disorders, so things like dyslexia, as well as those other areas I talked about, these are assessed and supported within the education system. So you can speak to your school. So for example, the Senko might be a key person here, and then the school can then contact specialist teachers for consultation and then look to offer a possible assessment. We do recognise here that this is currently focused on children who are in education. For those families where a child is not accessing education, it's also worth being aware that the autism and ADHD assessment process will explore these learning needs, and and can kind of think about whether some additional assessments are needed at that point. And you can also contact Sendias as well for further advice. I'm going to say more about Sendias towards the end. Yeah, to get some further advice around that area if you're in that position. And just to add before we discuss the specifics about an ADHD and an autism assessment, we also wanted to share that with both of these assessments, we know there has been a long gap for you between when your child was first referred and when you will have contact with these services. And therefore, in that kind of time, you may have seen a number of changes, both as your child has kind of developed, but also perhaps through the understanding that you've gained about some of their differences. So we just wanted to reassure you that at the point of screening with either the ADHD or the autism teams, there will be an opportunity for you to provide some additional information, to support that referral, that initial referral. And the reason why we're mentioning that is because that's a question that's come up from other parents. So we just felt that that was an important thing to share with you. So we're going to firstly think about ADHD referrals. So the ADHD team will carefully review the information, the referral information, to see if a neurodevelopmental assessment is required. And this may be for either ADHD, for autism, or for both. And if it's thought that your child may have ADHD, they then will send screening questionnaires, which will need to be completed by people who know the child well. And that's across multiple settings. So at home with you as parents and carers, but also school or different settings if your child currently isn't in school. So after that kind of initial screening process, after they've had those questionnaires back, the ADHD team will then advise you and the lead care professional, who is any professional that knows your child well and could well be someone in school if that's appropriate, of the outcome of that pre-assessment screening, and that will be by letter. And if they then decide, off the basis of that screening, that the young person does not require an assessment, they then will make recommendations in response to that young person's needs that have been identified as part of that screening process. But for those young people that have the more moderate to severe symptoms, they will be then added to the assessment waiting list. And then it's a very complex process. So it may involve several steps depending on the young person, may include different professionals. And initially, what will happen with that is that an appointment will be offered with a specialist nurse, and then this then may result in the offer of a diagnostic appointment. And that's then with the consideration of treatment or discharge with kind of recommendations of kind of what ongoing support is needed. So again, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully for those of you who have a child waiting for this assessment, it kind of gives you a bit more of an understanding of what to expect kind of next, what those next steps look like. So thinking about what happens to autism referral. So the important thing to say here is that there are kind of two parts to this. So the integrated pediatric service accept referrals for children under the age of 11 for an autism assessment. But actually, the Autism Youth Diagnostic Service in Suffolk, so ADIS for short, sees young people over the age of 11 and they're referred to that team. And referrals are reviewed in a similar way to the ADHD service, again, often with that multi-professional input, which is important to get kind of different professional perspectives and input there. And it includes a range of specific assessment tools at that point. I won't go into great detail about what they are, but essentially we've got some observational assessment tools as well as an interview as well. So just to say what the process looks like within the ADIS service. So as we said, this is the service for 11 to 17-year-olds in Suffolk. It's a needs-led pathway, which means that when a young person comes in for assessment, they first identify their strengths and difficulties through meeting with the young person and with you as their parent and carers, and really kind of gathering information from a range of people that know them well, really to get a sense of who they are. Um, and they then kind of through doing that develop an understanding together of what that young person's needs are. And within that, the following areas might be considered. So it would be around intellectual ability and learning styles, academic skills, speech and language and communication, fine and gross motor skills, adaptive behaviors, including self-help skills, mental and emotional health, physical health and nutrition, sensory sensitivities, and behavior likely to affect day-to-day functioning and social participation, as well as socialization skills. You see there are a real breadth of things that they will think about and explore as part of that assessment process. And then post autism assessment. So if your young person is given a diagnosis of autism, you'll then be invited to a post diagnostic appointment within the ADIS service, which is optional. And it's also important if your child is within an education setting to share that diagnosis with them. And as we can see on the screen there, it says so they can receive the right support. And as I would kind of reiterate here, that actually what Linda talked about is that this should absolutely be needs-based as well, needs-led as well. But if your child were to receive a diagnosis, that's an important thing that that education provider should be made aware of. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of kind of what to expect, once you come to the end of that initial wait. So we are coming to the end now. Thank you so much for bearing with us. We just want to share some really key resources, which you will be getting in the follow-up email, as well as some additional ones as well. So the poster you see here on the left, which I appreciate is probably very small for you, but you will be getting a bigger copy of it. So this is a poster of resources which are pulled together, and it's really from parents for parents on the ADHD or the ASD pathway. So it's by other parents who are in a similar position to yourself. So do take a look through those different areas, yeah, to find out what might be useful for you and your young person. And just to say about some of the links on the screen here, so the Suffolk local offer is a key resource, which will have updates regarding the NDD pathway in Suffolk. Suffolk family carers offer a range of different support, including one-to-one support or drop-ins for parents who are on the pathway in Suffolk. The Suffolk Parent Hub, again, has a host of information, including links to access parent programs such as Solihull and Webster Stratton, so you can sort of access peer support and skills. As well as some other signposting as well that might be relevant. We have the Parent Carer Network links there, which are two. So the first one is PACT, which is parents and carers together, and then the Suffolk Parent Carer Forum. And finally, the Source Engagement Hub, which is a website which provides information, support, and advice for young people and is by young people. So it might be a useful thing to share with your young people there too. We also have some additional specific resources around autism and ADHD. We won't talk through them today in the interest of time because we are wanting to finish on time, but these might be useful things if you want to know more that to take a look through. And as we've talked about throughout this workshop, this is the first introductory workshop in our kind of broader childhood neurodiversity workshop program. It's on a range of different topics, and I can tell you the dates for the first three that we've got coming up. And just to say, hopefully on the 5th of September, you would have received an email about these workshops, which contains links of how to kind of book up and get onto them. And it's the same process of what you've done for this workshop today. So future workshops include supporting social relationships. So that's your young person's social relationships around friendships and family. And that's on the 22nd of October. So you'll see myself again if you come along to that. We've got supporting your child's education on the 20th of November, and Linda will be there for that one. And then the next one after that is supporting your child with anxiety, which is the 17th of December. Now, we do have a range of other topics that we've kind of already decided around sleep, supporting sensory needs, around planning and ordering and remembering, low mood, managing big feelings and eating difficulties, and supporting your neurodiverse teenager. So please follow us on Eventbrite and you'll hear about when these workshops will be taking place. Just to say, our team also offer a workshop on mental health and wellbeing topics that kind of runs alongside our neurodiversity one. Again, you can see some of the previous and upcoming workshops that we've been running on the left-hand side there. And again, you sign up in the same way. So if you follow us on Eventbrite, you'll get updates about what that looks like, as well as following us on YouTube to see previous recordings as well. And on the right-hand side, we can see SENDIAS. So that is the Special Educational Needs and Disability Information, Advice and Support Service in Suffolk. And they also provide webinars, as well as some useful parent and carer information sessions and a parent helpline. So if you wanted to get some advice from them, please look at their website and use some of their resources and facilities.